Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of cyBARR Chats. This is the first episode in a special edition series focused on privacy. A study conducted by Pew Research Center found that 81% of US adults felt that they had very little or no control over the data that companies collect. Today, we're joined by healthcare privacy and compliance expert Swathi West to discuss privacy laws and regulations which help regulate data collection. So Swathi, before we dive into some specific laws, let's discuss the application of these regulations in general. Since we live in such a globalized world, can you explain how privacy regulations that may be specific to a certain country or area, for example, the GDPR in the EU, still affect companies and organizations everywhere?
You're right that we live in a globalized world, and it's important to understand that different cultures have different views and regulations on privacy. While many Americans tend to be less concerned with privacy, other countries in the world have strict privacy regulations and a stronger definition of privacy. The General Data Protection Regulation, which you mentioned, GDPR, is a great example of how privacy changes in our globalized, connected world. Since the GDPR is a regulation in the European Union, EU, American companies may think it doesn't impact them, if they have no presence in the EU or no US EU-based employees. But many US-based companies must comply with the GDPR if they offer goods or services to any EU residents or monitor the behavior of EU residents. And this reaches much further than you may think. You may think, oh, we're not working there in the EU, or we don't reside. But if you're working with any EU residents, that may affect. So, for example, if your website is based in the US, but still attracts European visitors, you must heed the GDPR. Similarly, in US, we have California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA, that can affect your businesses even if you aren't based in California. And obviously we can discuss this regulations further throughout our episode, but it's always important to understand that just because you're not in EU, you still have to comply with GDPR. The same way with CCPA, if you're not in California, you might have to still comply with California Consumer Privacy Act.
Thanks for that explanation. So we've discussed the GDPR a little bit, and when we think of privacy regulations, the GDPR is often the de facto association. So can you tell us a little more about this international privacy regulation?
Yes, I mean, that's when you think about privacy, GDPR is big. GDPR is out there. That's the most strict regulation, privacy regulation that we have today. And it is the most thorough privacy regulation that exists in the world today. It was passed in the EU in 2018 and sets guidelines for the collection and processing of personal information of individuals who live in the EU. Just to reiterate again, this is for collection and processing of personal information of individuals who live in the EU. And under GDPR, organizations have to ensure that not only are they gathering data legally, but also protecting the data from misuse or exploitation. This means that companies can be significantly more liable in the event of a data breach. On the individual level, the GDPR was designed to give EU citizens more control over their personal data. So organizations are required to notify customers if their data was compromised in a breach. It also makes it easier for consumers to understand how their data is being collected and also used.
Got it. That's really helpful information. Taking a step back, we're starting to throw around these terms. What does processing personal data really mean?
Great question. Like I said, let's take a step back. There's a lot of words, GDPR, and then there's personal data. But because these terms are important, I'll explain you what a personal data is. So personal data is any information connected to a person's identity. So any information that's connected to a person's identity is their personal data. So this can include your name, your job, your religion, address, and many more factors that would link directly back to you, your personal data. And processing personal data is collecting, it can be recording, it can be gathering, organizing, storing, using, or disclosing, or otherwise making personal data available by different electronic means. So that's what you processing of personal data is. And also another big term in GDPR is always a controller. So controller is the entity that controls the personal data and determines what will be done with it. So, these are very important terms. So thank you so much for asking that, Claire.
Yeah, that's a really great explanation for me and for our listeners. So we've talked about the GDPR. I'm curious about the US. Is privacy regulated at the federal level in the US?
It's always a question. Thank you so much again for asking that, because while the US doesn't have a single overarching data privacy regulation in the same way that the EU does with the GDPR, but there are a number of industry specific federal laws that encompass privacy. For example, we have HIPAA, which protects patients' personally identifiable information in the healthcare industry, their EPHI. And obviously, we covered this a lot extensively in our HIPAA blog. So if you're interested, please take a look. But we do have HIPAA that regulates at a federal level. Similarly, we have Graham-Leach-Bailey Act, which requires financial institutions to explain their data sharing practices to their customers to safeguard the sensitive data. Regardless of what industry you're in, it's always important to check with your governance and risk and compliance teams or your legal teams to ensure you're complying with that industry specific privacy laws that may apply to your organization. So it's always good to talk with your legal teams just to make sure you have that compliance part covered.
Got it. Okay, so we've talked about privacy on the international level and now the federal level. So let's dive into state privacy laws in the US. What state privacy laws exist in the US and how do they affect the rest of the country?
Great question again. And we talked about GDPR a little bit, which would affect EU residents in the same way we have CCPA, the California Act, and it is most prominent state privacy law in the US. So it gives customers more control over their data that businesses collect, including the right to know about the personal information that the business is collecting about them, how it's used or shared, and the right to delete the personal information, and also the right to opt out of the sale of their personal information, and also the right to non-discrimination for exercising their CCPA rights. So these are all the laws that are under that CCPA. And another thing to keep in mind is if your business serves California residents and meets one or more of the three requirements that are part of CCPA, you're required to comply. So just to get more info on that requirements, if you're having an annual gross revenue of over 25 million US dollars, or you're annually buying, receiving, selling, or sharing personal information of 50,000 or more consumers' household or devices, and deriving 50% or more of your annual revenue from selling customer data. So obviously this is part of California residents. So always think about these requirements, whether you're complying with CCPA, you're getting more information, you're selling personal information of any residents more than 50,000, just keep a lookout for this law. California being the most populous state, we always forget about it, right? You asked Claire, what about US? Thinking we have so many states and it's only state regulated for California, but doesn't mean it's only for California residents. California being the most populous state in the country, many organizations might be driving 50% of more annual revenue from selling customer data for California residents. So it's always important to understand whether you have to comply with CCPA, just make sure you look at the requirements. And this means that if a California customer, for example, visits your website and you have cookies collecting any information that could be linked with their personal identity, you will have to inform them and give them the option to opt out. So it's always, important. You just might be like, oh, this is just a website, this is a cookie collecting information, but you have to always make sure if you're collecting California residents' personal information, you should give them the ability to opt out, or just make sure you make a note that, hey, we're collecting the information. And a couple other states followed with California, like Virginia and Colorado, both recently followed California's example and passed similar comprehensive consumer privacy laws. And we will see this definitely, grow in larger scale in different states throughout US, and privacy is going to be the next big thing everyone's going to definitely talk about pretty soon.
Wow, thank you for all of that insight. That's so helpful. So you've discussed, how a lot of these regulations give consumers more control over their data. My last question for you is, what do organizations need to know about how these privacy regulations affect their business?
Businesses should always work closely with the legal compliance team to understand how privacy regulations affect their business. Like we talked about, right, Claire, and we talked about EU, GDPR, California, HIPAA. I mean, we have compliance regulations that businesses should follow today. It's always important to understand which one do we have to be compliant with. How many California residents data are we collecting, or how much business are we doing with EU residents? So these are all the things that you definitely have to talk with your legal and compliance team. And this might include a privacy attestation, right? There's always something we can do in regards to, like, hey, what data do we have today, and what compliance frameworks or regulations we have to be compliant with. So this might be a privacy attestation, or these might be the discussions that you have to talk with your audit and compliance partner like BARR. And just to conclude, it's always good to ask. And also, it's a best practice for a business to respect consumer privacy. And regardless of regulation, it is good for your business and good for your customers too, to be open and honest about your data collection practices. Let them know what you're collecting, how would you use, and things like that. And like I said, it's always good if you have any questions in regards to, like, hey, what regulations do we have to follow or comply with? It's always good to talk to your partners like BARR.
Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you, Swathi, for all of your valuable insight on privacy regulations on the international, federal, and state level. And we look forward to seeing everyone next time on cyBARR Chats in our privacy series.
Thank you.